Okay, so let's continue our lectures. In the last lecture, we talked about powers. We explained that powers can be a different terminology, a different way of looking at the ontological structure that we explained. So in the last lecture, we said, okay, if you start from objects and go to kinds, and from kinds to properties using the natural laws and the relation of instantiation, then we can talk about dispositional exemplification of that property with that, in that specific particular object, and then we defined power to be that disposition. And then we also explained the manifestation as a counterpart of the occurrent exemplification of that property. And so we realized that, okay, if we go that path and then we get to the powers, and then we have the power to phi and the manifestation of that power, which is phiing. And then we said, okay, sometimes it just makes more sense. It's just much easier to just talk about this object with its powers and just hide all that link on the background. And then we continued to talk about the features that powers have as a kind of counterpart to all the arguments that we had done for that, original trajectory that we went from the object to the disposition to the power. And then we said, okay, maybe we can redo everything using the terminology of powers. We talked about directedness, the fact that every power is a power for something. For instance, get the power of salt to be water soluble, or the power of a fragile statue to be broken or to break, and a power of the hammer to break. And then we said that every power is a power for something, that is for that manifestation. We also talked about the independence, that every power is ontologically independent of their manifestation because it's only directed at that manifestation. We talked about the actuality, that power is more than just a possibility of manifestation. We talked about intrinsicality, which didn't provide an argument for it, but we just explained that we think that power has this kind of feature that is an intrinsic property. On the power side, we didn't defend it, but on the other side of kinds and using natural law, it makes sense to say that there are intrinsic properties of their bearers. Objectivity remained, that powers are independent of the psychological structure of a human observers. These are something that exist in the outside world. Now, of course, we have again defended this on the normal trajectory that we came by basically defending the existence of kinds and the universals in general and natural laws. So in that case, we have already defended a kind of objectivity to their existence, but now again trying to reinforce it from the terminology of powers as well. So what can we say about the objectivity? The best way to treat it is to treat the objections that can be applied to it. Now, before that, I will try to divide powers into a couple of categories, and then we will get to that objection in a moment. So first, powers, we can divide them into two categories, causal and non-causal. And by non-causal powers, we mean those powers whose manifestation consists in the bearer of that power causing a change to happen in itself or others. So for instance, the power of the water to solve salt is a causal power, in a sense that when it manifests that power, the manifestation of that power consists in water causing a change in the salt. That is, it causes it to be dissolved. So it causes a change. So it's a causal power. So a magnet has a causal power in the sense that when it's manifested, the manifestation of that magnetic power means the attraction of some metal. So the magnet is causing a change to happen in that metal particle. A non-causal one is one that does not consist, the manifestation does not consist in causing a change, in the bearer causing a change. For instance, when we say that a statue is fragile, is not a causal power, because when it is manifested, when the glass statue breaks down, it's not the statue breaking itself. The statue has the power to break down easily, but when it breaks, it doesn't mean that it itself breaks itself down or causes change in itself or something else. It's something from outside with the causal power that causes this thing to break down. That's why in traditional sense, usually they don't call these powers. They usually call them liabilities. But we just use the same language. We just call all of them powers. So that's the difference, causal and non-causal. And as I also explained last time, an object may have a power to gain another power. So for instance, some metals have the non-causal power to become magnetized. It's non-causal again because when it is manifested, it's not the metal causing a change to happen in itself or in something else. They have this power to become magnetized, and when that power is manifested, that is, they become magnetized, then they gain a power that they didn't have before to attract some metals. They gain the causal now power to attract some metals. These are the second order powers. Or a stone has the non-causal power to be thrown, and by being thrown, it gains the causal power to break a glass. So in general, X can have power to phi, and by phiing, gain the power to psi. So that's a higher order power. Okay, with those definitions, that's just something to get out of our way, because we will use that kind of concept of powers later on. Let's go back to the objectivity of powers. And one famous objection to it comes from David Hume. And now Hume attacks the idea of causation, power, or natural law. They're all on the same side, as you can see. Powers, natural laws, causation, they all relate to each other. As we also saw, that powers are basically in the end just discuss a causal relation, because powers can be causal. If they're causal, then there is a causal relation. If they're non-causal, then something else causes that change, which is causal. So this always, again, comes down to causality. So causation, power, natural law, they're all on the same side. And Hume objects to that and says that it seems that the idea of causation requires a kind of necessary connection between the cause and its effect. And Hume claims that this concept of necessary connection cannot be applied. Like, there is no such thing in the outside world. There is no necessary connection between the cause and effect, or between a power and the manifestation, or the kind or the properties that the natural law is trying to describe. And there is no necessary connection. So we will look into that argument to see how it works. And the first premise of the argument of Hume is a hidden assumption. I mean, it's his basic thoughts about it, but he doesn't talk about explicitly for this argument. And that's that all objects of human reason and inquiry is divided into two different categories. One is the relations of ideas, and the other one is the matters of fact. So for Hume, some propositions are about just ideas that we have in our mind. Like, think about it when we're doing mathematics, you're just thinking about these abstract ideas and you can find a connection between them. Now Hume says, these are discoverable by mere operation of thought without dependence on what's anywhere exists in the universe. We don't need to know anything about outside to find a connection between these ideas. So when you say, for instance, that bachelors are not married, these sort of relation exists between ideas, it doesn't matter about the outside world. Just mere idea of those and ideas and those concepts create that kind of relation. And the other one are the reasoning concerning the matters of fact. And these do not have an a priori basis. These are the things that you need to first observe in the outside world. It's about what we experience. We have to look outside in the world to find that thing. Now, so as a concept, Hume has this thing that, okay, if we understand what we're talking about, if a concept can be applied, then it should either be a priori applied or a posteriori. Because if it's not a priori, if it's not a posteriori, then it just cannot be applied in the sense that we just don't know what we're talking about. If it's not a relation a priori in our mind, or if it's not something that we can gain like an understanding of it from the experience, or find a ground of reasoning for their existence from the outside world, then we just cannot talk about it. It's just meaningless to talk about that concept because we have no idea what we're talking about. That concept, just we cannot apply it. So that's like the first premise. Now the second premise is that the concept of power cannot be applied a priori. So Hume says that, and I quote, "I shall venture to affirm as a general proposition, which admits of no exception, that the knowledge of this relation," here he talks about the cause and effect, "is not in any instance attained by reasoning a priori. There are no objects which by the mere survey, without consulting experience, we can determine to be the causes of any other, and no objects which can certainly determine in the same manner not to be causes. Anything may produce anything." So Hume says a priori, there's nothing we can say about stuff. There's nothing that we can say, okay, like this thing cannot produce that thing. No, anything can produce anything. There's no a priori rule, right? So this necessary connection that we think exists between the power and the manifestation, or the cause and effect, or natural laws, we say that, like when we say that salt dissolves in water, that's like a necessary thing. It's like it's part of the reality that we live, that salt dissolves in water. But Hume says, okay, a priori, there's nothing about it. Like there's no way that we can just think about in the idea of salt. There is that it's water soluble. There's nothing about it. So anything may produce anything. There's no a priori basis for the concept of power or causality or natural law. He continues that Adam, though his rational faculties be supposed, at the very first entirely perfect, could not have inferred from the fluidity and transparency of water that it would suffocate him, or from the light and warmth of fire that it would consume him. There's nothing in the idea of water, and if you know that it's like a substance that is fluid and is transparent, there's nothing in these ideas that tell you that, okay, if that's the case, then it's gonna kill me if I get soaked in it. Or about the light or warmth of fire. There's nothing in those ideas that tell you, okay, it's gonna burn you alive. No object ever discovers, by the qualities which appear to the senses, either the causes which produced it or the effects which will arise from it. Nor can our reason, unassisted by experience, ever draw any inference concerning real existence and matter of fact. So just thinking about these things, if we don't see the experience, there's nothing that we can do. There's no way that we can discover a kind of relation, a priori relation between a cause and effect just based on what those ideas are. And then the third premise, Hume says that there's nothing in our experience that entails that anything has power. He says, and I quote, "I say then that even after," so now a priori is over it, so even after we have experience of the operations of cause and effect, like you eat bread and you get fulfilled. You see a cause and you see an effect. Our conclusions from that experience are not founded on reasoning or any process of the understanding. Hume says that if you see that you see this cause and this is the effect. This happened and then this happened. You hit this ball and that ball starts to move. Even if we see that, we cannot conclude, if we conclude from that there is a necessary connection, that's not based on reasoning or any process of understanding. Our sense informs us of the color, weight, and consistency of bread, but neither sense nor reason can inform us of those qualities which fit us for nourishment and support of human body. So again, Hume says that even if we look at these experiences, there's nothing in them that implies that there is a necessary cause and effect relation between those two. You eat the bread, you get fulfilled. You eat again, you get fulfilled. Okay. Does that entail that there is a necessary connection between these two? No. It could be that you eat bread and it's not fulfilling anymore, right? And you can see again the counterpart of it on the previous trajectory in terms of natural laws, the all statements, the normal all statements, the uniformity of nature that we discussed before. So now we're doing it again in the terminology of powers, the whole argument. He continues, in reality, there is no part of matter that ever does, by sensible qualities, discover any power of energy, or give us ground to imagine that it could produce anything, or be followed by any other object, which we could denominate its effect. So you can do this. So that, look, if we're looking at those qualities, what's happening, and we cannot infer from that. We cannot say, okay, if that's happening, therefore that thing has that power. Solidity, extension, motion, these qualities are all complete in themselves and never point to any other events which may result in them. Just because something we say, okay, that's the thing, any quality that they have, they complete. When you know about them, when you see them, it doesn't entail that, okay, if that's the case, that this implies that this thing causes another thing, that this thing will break that window. There's nothing in that thing itself, the experience, that implies that thing. So that's the third premise, that there's nothing in our experience that entails that anything has any powers. And the conclusion is, therefore, the concept of power or causality or natural law cannot be applied. Basically, it doesn't make any sense. These concepts don't have any meaning. Or in other words, there's no objectivity to them. And as we can have no idea of anything which never appeared to our outward sense or inward sentiment, the necessary conclusion seems to be that we have no idea of the connection or power at all. So that necessary connection between cause and effect, or that power that we're talking about, we have no idea of that. And that these words are absolutely without any meaning when employed either in philosophical reasoning or common life. So when you say that, yeah, if I throw this stone has the power to break that window, what you're talking about, you're not talking about anything real. Because there's no basis for that. There's no a priori basis for saying that there's a power in that stone to break that window. There is no a posteriori reason to think that's the case. And therefore, it's not the case at all. So let's investigate this argument. So in full, this is the argument. Premise 1, the concept can be applied. Then it can be applied a priori or a posteriori. The concept of power cannot be applied a priori. There's nothing in our experience that entails that anything has powers. Therefore, the concept of power cannot be applied. Now, this argument in this form that we got out of Hume's text, it's not valid, of course, because the third premise does not mean that powers cannot be applied a posteriori. We have to add something to make the argument valid. And that's the premise 4 added here, that a concept can be applied a posteriori only if the experiential grounds for its application entail that a concept applies. Only if we have this, then with the combination of premise 3, then we can get the concept of power cannot be applied a posteriori. And now with 1, 2, and 5, we can get the concept of power cannot be applied. So now this is a valid argument. If the premises are true, then we can agree that powers, they don't mean anything. They don't apply. They're not objective things, just meaningless words. But premise 4, exactly that hidden premise, is crucial now. A concept can be applied a posteriori only if experiential grounds for its application entail that the concept applies. It has to imply. So when you see the experience, it has to imply that that concept exists or applies. This is what we call the thesis of deductivity. So a concept can be applied a posteriori only if the experiential ground for its application entail or imply that the concept applies. Now, first of all, note that we cannot defend this thesis by saying that it's our intuition or it's self-evident. Why? Because intuition or self-evident claims, they don't imply that something is true. So if you say that I have an intuition that X is true, your intuition does not imply that X is true. It might guide you towards that. It might tell you that, okay, it might be true because you have intuition, but it doesn't imply, right? And saying self-evident, basically, we're not providing anything to say that it implies that it's true. So in other words, the thesis itself rules out that it cannot be supported by anything that does not entail it, right? Because the thesis of deductivity itself says that a concept can only be applied a posteriori if there is something that experience implies that concept. So we say, okay, let's apply this thesis itself to itself. If thesis of deductivity can be applied, it means that there should be some experiential ground that implies it, because there is no a priori thing, of course, for this. So if there are some concepts that imply that thesis of deductivity is true, then we would have some ground for its being applied a posteriori. So this already is alarming us that this thesis is a little bit too strong. But we can actually show it in a better way. First, the argument, if this thesis of deductivity is true, an argument that should hold, but if the thesis of deductivity is true, it wouldn't hold. For instance, if we say that we have looked everywhere for a white raven and we have not found one yet, therefore we have a posteriori reason that there are no white ravens. If the thesis of deductivity is true, then this argument is not valid. But the problem is that it should be valid, right? I mean, if we have looked everywhere and we haven't seen a white raven, that's a very good a posteriori reason to claim that there are no white ravens. But note that since looking everywhere and not finding a white raven, we cannot get anything out of it. That doesn't imply that there are no white ravens. It's just that you haven't seen one. Even Hume himself uses this sort of argument. He says that it is impossible in any one instance to show the principle in which the force or agency of a cause is placed. Now, he's talking about some principle, and then says, if anyone think proper to refute this assertion that he's making, he need not put himself to the trouble of inventing any long reasoning, but may at once show us an instance of a cause where we discover the power or operating principle. This defiance we're obliged frequently to make use of as being almost the only means of proving a negative in philosophy. So Hume is talking about something, and he's claiming that, look, there is no principle of causality anywhere. And then he says, okay, some people might think that, no, there is a principle of causality. And then he says, okay, then show me one. I mean, if you don't need to go and invent arguments, just show me one case of that white raven, and I would agree that the white raven exists. And he says that this is the only means of proving a negative. And Hume says, look, the only way that I can prove that there are no white ravens is to say that, look, I've looked everywhere, there are no white ravens. If you think that's false, just show me one. So it seems that Hume himself is using this sort of argument that we have looked everywhere, we didn't find it, so we have a posteriori reason to believe that there are no white ravens. But the point is that if thesis of deductivity is true, this should not hold. Or another argument that should not hold, but does hold if the thesis of deductivity is true. If the concept of capacity of feeling pain in primates can be applied, then it can be applied either a priori or a posteriori. Now, the concept of feeling pain cannot be applied a priori. There's nothing in the ideas of a primate and pain that we say, okay, primates feel pain. There's nothing a priori about it. But there's nothing also in our experience that implies that any primates feel any pain. Like, imagine a chimpanzee or something. You apply something, you do something, you see it scream, it's jumping up and down, it's trying to run away. Does that imply that they're feeling pain? No, because it might be that it's just a robot, it's just the squeaking of the gears. They just behave that way. There's no feeling inside. So just because they're screaming, like a robot can also scream, that doesn't mean that they're feeling pain. There's nothing in that experience that implies that they're feeling pain. But if the thesis of deductivity is true, that means that the concept of feeling pain in primates cannot be applied a posteriori. But it couldn't apply a priori, then that means that primates cannot feel pain, because this concept of primates feeling pain is just a weird concept, It's exactly like the causality or the natural law or the powers. It's meaningless. So primates cannot feel pain. But of course, this is not true, right? Everyone say, well, this should hold. Sorry, this argument should not hold. I mean, that the conclusion is false. This again shows that thesis deductivity is just too strong. And we know exactly why it's too strong. Because the thesis says that for the X to hold a posteriori, that is, for experience to provide support for X, the thesis of deductivity says that we need the empirical data E to entail it. If we want to say that data supports X, we need the data to imply X. That's not true. That's not how we use empirical data. We use a much weaker version. The weaker version is that if X implies E, then E is evidence for X. You see, it's not the other way around. It's the X that implies the empirical data, and when we observe the empirical data, it's an evidence for X. For instance, let's apply it to these two arguments and see how they're fixed. We have looked everywhere for white raven. We have not found it. Therefore, we have a posterior reason that there are no white ravens. That works. Why? Because if there are no white ravens, then this implies that we can never find them anywhere. Now, we cannot find them anywhere. That's an evidence that there are no white ravens. Works perfectly. The feeling of pain, the screams and everything that the primates make, does not imply that they're feeling pain. But feeling pain, if they were feeling pain, implies that they would scream and they would run away. Now, since they scream and run away, that's evidence that they feel pain. So in the same sense, when you pour salt in the water and it dissolves, or you eat the food, you eat the bread and it fulfills you, of course you cannot, from eating and getting fooled, from throwing the stone and breaking the window, you cannot conclude that there are those powers. But the point is, that's not the case. That's not what we want to do here. What we want to say is that if there are powers, then if you put salt in water, it would dissolve. Then if you throw that stone, they would break the window. So when we see that those things happen, when we see that the fragile things, when you hit them, they just break, then that's an evidence that those powers exist. That would be an a posteriori reason for believing that the powers are real. So this would be a defense for the objectivity of powers. It's a counterpart again to the natural laws, the all statements, all normal probability statements, because someone might try to change this argument to make it better by including these kind of probabilities or normal. But again, all the things that we talked about the last time can be applied again into this new language. We just have to translate them. I guess this is the final lecture on powers. From the next lecture, we will look into a new ontological category of persons.